Boldwood presents The Soldier's Daughter, written by AnneMarie Brear and read by Catherine Harvey. The moral right of the author has been asserted. This performance is owned by Boldwood.
Chapter 1. Lilston Village, West Yorkshire, England. January 1860. Evie Davenport skipped lightly down the stairs, a book of British birds in her hand. At the half landing she paused and glanced out of the window at the crunching sound of a carriage on the snow-covered drive. As the woman descended from the vehicle, Evie groaned. Mrs. Meyer. A widow from the village, the woman was like a homing pigeon. The minute Evie or her papa were indoors, she arrived. Quickly changing her mind about sitting in front of the fire with her book, Evie dashed to the cupboard by the stairs and pulled on her coat. She flung off her house slippers and hurriedly put on her boots, tying the laces around the hooks so fast she missed several. The doorbell rang. Evie plucked her black felt hat from a hook and squashed it on her hair, with only one pin to secure it. Fanny, the housemaid, came along the corridor that led to the kitchen, wiping her hands on her apron as she did so. "Oh, miss, I didn't know you were going out. Shall I send for the carriage?" No, it's fine, Fanny. I'm going for a long walk, likely to Bellingham Hall." "The snow has stopped, miss, but it'll be deep in places." Fanny straightened her apron as the doorbell jangled again. "Tell my papa," Evie whispered, fastening the last button on her coat. Fanny opened the door, and Mrs. Meyer sailed in with a look of displeasure on her beautiful face. Her pointed glare at Fanny spoke 1,000 words, but she also voiced them. "Dear me, girl, you are tardy at answering the doorbell. In this weather especially, you should not keep your master's guests waiting in the cold. Punctuality is a most prized virtue, and one that you should uphold in respect for this household's reputation." "Begging your pardon, madam." Fanny bobbed her knees, her freckled face keeping straight, though her green eyes danced merrily. Mrs. Meyer turned for Fanny to help her off with her cape, and noticed Evie standing by the cupboard. "Goodness, child, what are you doing hiding there?" "Not hiding. I was just on my way out, Mrs. Meyer." "In that state?" Evie put a hand up to her hat and adjusted it, then checked the buttons on her coat were done up correctly. "I was in a hurry." "To go for a walk in this weather?" "It is good to walk for one's health." "Not in 0 temperatures, surely." The older woman slipped off her gloves, disapproval etched on her fine features. "Papa says it is good for the lungs." Evie couldn't help but taunt, knowing Mrs. Meyer would not speak against anything Major Davenport said. "Indeed, but I am here now, so take off your things and we shall have some tea. Your dear papa will be most pleased to have us both for company." Evie bristled at being commanded by this woman. "Forgive me, Mrs. Meyer," she replied with false sweetness, "but I am expected at Bellingham Hall." She lied. "Gracious, you spent far too much time at that hall." Mrs. Meyer swept her haughty gaze around the fine entrance as though ready to pick fault with it. Not that she could. Fanny kept the whole house tidy and clean, a large task for someone who had to be the parlour-maid, chambermaid, and everything in between. Evie smiled brightly. "Good day, Mrs. Meyer." "Where is the Major?" "In his study." Evie hesitated, torn as whether to stay and protect her papa from this woman's wiles, or to flee and be free of her condescension. "We were not expecting visitors." "But I told the Major I would be calling today. I mentioned it before you left to visit your aunts last week." "We only returned from Bradford last evening. It must have slipped his mind." She gave Mrs. Meyer a small shrug, as though a visit by her was not important to them. Mrs. Meyer's shoulders straightened at the slight. Then I shall go in and surprise him. He will be delighted to spend an hour or so with me." Evie stepped forward. "Fanny, please inform my papa that Mrs. Meyer is waiting for him in the parlour." She waved her arm towards the parlour's open door, indicating for the woman to enter. On no account did she want the pushy woman to invade Papa's study, which was a small room, his private sanctuary, and not where he should entertain lady visitors. Annoyance clearly on her face, Mrs. Meyer swished the full skirts of her steel grey dress and marched into the parlour. Evie stood at the door. "I'll say good day to you, Mrs. Meyer, for I doubt you will still be here when I return." She turned away before the woman could answer and felt a flash of success at getting a small victory over the widow. She strode down the drive, treading in the ruts made by carriage wheels, and along the road leading to the village halfway down the valley. The crunch of snow beneath her boots still gave Evie a curious wonderment. This was her second winter in England, and the charm of a frozen world outside her door delighted her, at least for short periods of time. No matter how pretty the countryside looked, covered in virgin white, she would rather have the bright days of sunshine, if not the energy-sapping heat of India, where she had been born and raised. Her black boots and the hem of her thick black woolen coat were soon caked in snow. Wearing black was another thing to contend with. In India, she had only ever worn pastel colours. However, all that changed on the journey from Bombay to London. Her British parents had decided to leave India when her papa, a decorated major, retired from the British Army after the Indian Rebellion had been fought. Papa believed he was too old now at 58 to be caught up in strife, and didn't fancy a desk position at headquarters or in some remote village far from civilization. So, after 20-odd years in the subcontinent, they'd packed up, said tearful farewells to servants and friends, and travelled the long, tortuous journey home to England. Evie had been both sad and excited to be leaving India and going home to England, a home she'd never seen before, but which was held in great esteem by her parents and her maternal grandmama who lived with them. Leaving their friends and saying goodbye to servants she'd known all her life had been a wrench, but the excitement soon replaced the sadness. England, in her mind, seemed a magical place that so many of her friends spoke about with such longing. Mamma and Grandmama often wrote long letters to cousins and aunts and received packages of English treats. Papa read English newspapers. They toasted Queen Victoria at every party and dinner. To Evie, England was the home she'd never seen, and her imagination grew at how wonderful it would be. The voyage from Bombay to Suez had been a wonder to Evie. Unlike her grandmama, she didn't get seasick on the steamer, and although the boat wasn't very luxurious, she had plenty of time to read and talk to the several other British passengers making the trip home. In the Egyptian town of Suez, the family had spent a few days in a hotel, waiting for the Suez to Alexandria train, which had only recently opened, meaning tickets were in much demand. The tedious, hot and dusty train journey took them through the desert, and Mamma complained that they should have sailed in a ship around the Cape of Good Hope instead of taking this dirty, energy-sapping route. But Papa explained that this journey cut the 6-month sea voyage to 2 months and was worth the discomfort. He'd read a report on how the French had managed to get permission to build a large shipping canal from Port Said to Suez. Papa said it would transform the world of shipping, even if Lord Palmerston disagreed. Papa had arranged a short stop in Cairo for them along the way to break up the train journey and to visit an old school friend there. Evie spent the first week in Cairo in a daze of shopping in bazaars and socialising with fellow British families who lived there and who they were introduced to by Papa's friend, Mr. Daintree. It was at a Christmas party in mid-December that Papa interrupted her dancing with a young gentleman and told her Mamma was not feeling well. 4 days later, Mamma died from a fever brought on by food poisoning, and 2 days after that, Grandmamma suffered a fatal stroke at Mamma's funeral. Within a week, Evie had lost her beloved Mamma and Grandmamma, and the family number had halved. Dazed, reeling from shock, they left Cairo a day before Christmas and didn't celebrate the special day, for they were too wrapped up in their misery. The rest of the voyage to Alexandria, then across the Mediterranean to France, and another long train trip up the French countryside before finally crossing the Channel to London, passed in a blur of grief. In the English Channel, thick fog surrounded the boat, cutting them off from the world. When they finally docked at a wharf on the Thames, Evie could only cling to her grief-stricken Papa as they stepped onto a rain-washed London dock. The cold hit Evie like a continual slap. No matter how many layers of clothing she wore, she couldn't get warm. London was bleak in winter, all grey sky, grey buildings, grey river and grey-dressed people. That she and Papa wore severe mourning black added to their gloom. Papa asked her if she wanted to return to India, but she couldn't imagine being there without Mamma. She knew he felt the same, and as much as England was a strange place to her, she'd rather start again and make new memories, living in the country where her parents had been raised. They travelled to the county of Yorkshire in the north, the birthplace of her parents. Papa had a cousin who lived in Leeds, and Mamma's aunts were in Bradford. Papa deemed it sensible to find a home where they had some family, if nothing else. Despite thick snowfalls, which intrigued and delighted Evie, who'd never seen snow up close, but only from a distance one time, when she saw the snow-capped Himalayas. She and her Papa toured many towns in the western parts of Yorkshire, looking for a suitable home. One day in January, snow thick on the ground, with a blue sky above and the sun shining, Evie descended the hired carriage and walked up the path of High Lilston House. Immediately, the 2-storey sandstone-bricked house grabbed her attention. It was situated above the village of Lilston, on a slope of a hill that continued to rise behind them towards the undulating moors and the larger Ilkley Moor beyond. The property had a few garden beds covered in snow, but several bare rose bushes stood proudly, and some tall, graceful trees, their branches weighted with snow, bordered the front sloping lawn. Behind the house was a flat cobbled yard, a decent stable block, and outbuildings. 10 acres, Evie, Papa read from the leaflet the land agent had given him. We don't need 10 acres. We said we'd get a horse each, Papa, so we can ride together like we used to, and then we need carriage horses too. 10 acres is the least we should consider. He nodded, and they explored inside the house, which was cold and musty and decorated in dark wood panelling. It needs improvements. Papa frowned, looking about. We can have it done and make it our own. Evie explored the downstairs, quickly seeing the place as it could be. The parlour, dining room, and small study all needed redecorating. The kitchen needed fresh paint, and she didn't dare venture down into the dark cellar. Upstairs, the 4 bedrooms were showing stages of damp, the wallpaper faded and old. The attic rooms were filled with unwanted furniture that needed to be sorted and cleaned, but overall, she was delighted with the house, especially the view. From every window at the front of the house, you could see the rooftops of the little village of Lilston, and beyond that, for miles over the Aire Valley, through the centre of which ran the River Aire and the Leeds and Liverpool Canal. Behind the house, the view consisted of treeless moorland. Papa bought the property, and High Lilston House became their home. Evie threw herself into redecorating the house over the spring and summer. As promised, Papa bought her and himself a horse each, and she enjoyed exploring the moorland and the valley. Their grief gave them a bond. The house gave them comfort. But it was the new society of friends that gave them a sense of belonging, of being able to begin again. Within a short space of time, Evie had made friends with Sophie Bellingham, a wealthy rail baron's daughter from Bellingham Hall. The large estate dominated the village, providing work and custom to the local community. The respected Bellingham family and their friends accepted Major Davenport and Evie with open arms, and that first year wasn't as difficult as it could have been. They transformed the house, engaged servants, and, by the autumn of that year, they felt a part of the local society. Slipping on some ice, Evie slowed down her strides, not wanting to fall. Papa would not cope with her having an accident. Some weeks ago had been the first anniversary of Mamma and Grandmamma's deaths, which had been difficult and solemn. Papa had not left his study for 3 days. Evie dreaded Christmas, their second without Mamma, but thankfully the Bellinghams had insisted they spend Christmas with them, and Evie had thanked the fates for giving them such good friends. After Christmas, they had gone to Bradford for a week to spend time with the old aunts. This had given Evie the chance to attend the theatre, dine at fancy restaurants, and have new dresses made. Evie had wanted to keep Papa busy, but when he wasn't busy, his mind slipped into the heavy grief of losing Mamma. She dragged poor Papa around the shops, doing what she could to keep him from his sorrow. But now they were home, and with the winter weather keeping them mostly indoors, she wondered what she could do to keep Papa happy. His bouts of low mood frightened her. She felt out of her depth when he refused to leave his study. The crunch of rumbling wheels beyond the curve of the lane sent her hurrying off to the side of it. Only one other dwelling was on this lane. Lilston Top Farm was further beyond their home, and she expected it to be the farmer, Mr. Lund. Only the carriage that appeared was black and shiny, and nothing at all like Mr. Lund's old rickety cart. Evie smiled as Sophie tucked her head out of the window. "Evie, you're home!" "Yes." She waited for Sophie to open the carriage door and climbed in. "We arrived home last evening." Sophie threw her arms around her and kissed her cold cheek. "I'm so pleased. I have missed you." "I have missed you too, even though it's only been a week," she laughed. "Well, since we became friends, I declare this was the longest we've been apart from each other." "No, last summer you spent 2 weeks on the coast." Sophie scowled. "Oh yes, we did. I was most put out that Mamma wouldn't allow me to invite you." "We had only known each other for a few months then. I was a stranger to your Mamma." "But we've been close friends from the moment you arrived here last January. Gosh, it has been a year already." Evie nodded. "Papa bought the house on the 20th of January. And today is the 20th. A whole year we have been friends, for we met straight away, didn't we?" Evie grinned, remembering. "Yes, you were going up to Mr. Lund's farm, for he was ill, and you were taking him a basket of food. You stopped the carriage and introduced yourself." "Well, I was so excited to see new faces come to live here, I simply had to stop when I saw you directing the men carrying boxes inside." "I'm terribly glad you did." Evie didn't know what she'd do without Sophie as her best friend, despite the age difference of Sophie being younger by a few years. "Were you walking down to see me in this weather?" "I was, to take tea with you and tell you all about my week in Bradford, but it seemed a nuisance to ask Bronson to get the carriage out, and I dared not ride Star in case she stumbled on the ice." Evie's adored horse was her most prized possession. Also, Mrs. Meyer has just called, and I needed to leave as quickly as possible. That woman has no manners. You are recently arrived home, and she is instantly making calls. She is not family." Indeed. Papa was answering his post, but he'll put it aside to entertain her. I mentioned that you were expecting me and left before tea was brought in. Papa will be cross with me. "Home, Jackson, if you please," Sophie called to the driver. They lurched on the seat as Jackson turned the horses about on the driveway entrance to Evie's house. "There's her horrid old horse and gig." Sophie glared at the offending vehicle. "How did she know what day you would be home? Did your papa tell her?" "Oh, he must have done. She called the day before we left." Evie turned her gaze away and stared straight ahead. Mrs. Myers' frequent calls were becoming a habit and a nuisance. "I wish Mamma had never introduced your papa to her." "It's a small village. They would have met anyway." "Mamma regrets it now, especially as Mrs. Meyer spends all her time visiting your papa. How does he put up with her calling every second day?" "He doesn't seem to mind." Evie shrugged, trying not to let it show how much she minded. Besides, when Papa was in one of his black moods, Mrs. Meyer took him out of it. "No, he wouldn't. Mamma says all the single men in a 10-mile radius are in love with Mrs. Meyer. My papa is not." Evie hated the thought of anyone replacing her beloved Mamma. "He is sensible, then." Evie thought for a moment. "Mrs. Meyer must have what men admire, though. She is attractive, I grant you. Blonde, with an enviable figure and fine features. Plus, she is accomplished. All the things men seem to want from a woman by their side." Evie admitted, wishing the woman wasn't quite so gifted with exemplary features and talents. To men, she was a simpering delight, fluttering her eyelashes and pouting her full lips. "Well, if she is the perfect specimen that men prefer, I shall become an old maid for sure." Sophie sighed deeply. Evie grasped her hand. "Nonsense. You are lovely." She smiled at her friend, who was petite, shy, kind and generous, if not a little highly strung at times. "I am a mouse. My brothers tell me often enough." Sophie's mouth twisted in anguish. "Dull brown hair. My eyes are no particular colour, neither brown or hazel, and I'm so small, most men think I am still a child." Evie laughed. "They do not." "Why? Haven't you already got a wonderful man ready to claim you? Your Mr. Lucas?" "My Mr. Nothing," is more the answer. "Alexander and I have made no promises to each other. Not really, anyway. We got along extremely well then. We've danced at many a ball and have been riding together. His father and mine are great friends. They expect something to happen between us, but there is not anything put in place, if you understand my meaning." "If Alexander Lucas, whoever he is, does not claim you for his bride the minute he returns from America, then he is not worthy of you." Sophie grinned. "And if he doesn't, you and I shall become old maids together." Evie winked. "You," Sophie pealed. "Never. You've already got half the men in the county talking about you, and the other half are too old that they can't see you properly, or they'd be madly in love with you too." "Stop it." Evie blushed a little. "It is true. At every party and dinner you've attended, you've been given such attention." "It is because I am new to the area, and I am the girl born and raised in India. The novelty will wear off soon enough." "I highly doubt it. Even Mamma said so. You have been here a year now. I am surprised your hand in marriage has not been asked for a dozen times by now." "May I remind you that I am too tall, too outspoken, and not as polished as the other young ladies?" Evie gave a wry lift of her eyebrows. "Mrs. Meyer has mentioned it to me already, just how unsuitable I am, and not to expect a decent offer of marriage. Not that I want to marry, anyway. She constantly had conflicting emotions about marriage. Women of her society were meant to think only of getting married, of being a good wife and mother. Evie didn't really know if she wanted that. She had yet to meet a man who would make her want to give up her independence. "Mrs. Meyer is a nasty, jealous woman," Sophie declared. "To say that to you is deplorable." "But what if she's correct, Sophie? Am I an oddity?" Evie dropped her voice. It wasn't often she lost confidence in herself, but the beautiful Mrs. Meyer had spoken those words one day during last summer when Evie had said something she didn't approve of, something about owning slaves. Mrs. Meyer had been alarmed that Evie not only knew about such things, but dared to comment on them in public. The older woman was quite vocal about Evie's lack of qualities. In India, she had always enjoyed the freedom of doing as she pleased, of having a voice at her papa's table. But here in England, she was meant to conform, to be quiet and biddable. Since that day, Evie had disliked the woman intensely. Yet what if the widow was right? Evie wasn't small and petite like Sophie. Instead, she was tall for a woman at 5'7". She had long, powerful legs from years of riding and swimming and playing with the servants' children in the hot, dry climate of India. Her thick hair was a mess of colours, from gold to reddish brown, as though it couldn't make up its mind what colour it wanted to be. Then there was her skin. Living in a sun-soaked country had given her skin the colour of warm caramel. Mamma had despaired over it, demanding she cover up, wear wider hats, use parasols for shade. But Evie had ridden and played and spent hours outside, and her creamy skin would darken where it was exposed, giving her unsightly tan lines. "Mrs. Meyer is not correct," Sophie declared. "You are simply stunning. Everyone says so. Mamma says you turn every man's head, and that Major Davenport needs to watch out for you." "Watch out for me? Why should Papa watch out for me?" "Because you are the daughter of a wealthy man, and you are unique," Sophie explained as they climbed from the carriage in front of the impressive Bellingham Hall. Unique? Evie followed her into the house, no longer overwhelmed by the opulence of the Bellinghams' wealth. Her papa wasn't without means. He'd invested heavily in schemes in India and earned well from them, and her two maiden great-aunts, Rose and Mary, were affluent from inheritances, but even they didn't come close to the fortune Mr. Bellingham had made in the railways, carriage-making and coal-mine business. "Indeed." Sophie gave a footman her gloves and coat and waited while Evie did the same. "What shall we do?" "Finish this conversation?" Evie joked, admiring her friend's blue woolen dress with its red piping. Evie wore a black dress with a black lace fringe. She'd not worn a nice colour for 12 months and was itching to do so. She believed her mamma would be happy to see her dressed in fine colours again. Sophie slipped her arm through Evie's. "We shall discuss something else. Talking about ourselves for too long is terribly indulgent." They went into the drawing room just as Lydia Bellingham came in through another doorway carrying a book. "Evie, you are returned from Bradford. How lovely to see you." Sophie's mother was a kind woman and had encouraged their friendship. Not that it was needed, for Evie and Sophie had grown close very quickly. "Yes, Mrs. Bellingham, yesterday evening." "Are your great-aunts in good health?" "They are." "Was Bradford enjoyable?" "It was. I still find it surprising to be living close enough to be able to visit my great-aunts when all my life I've only ever written to them." "They must be delighted to have you so near." Mrs. Bellingham took a seat. "You are staying for afternoon tea?" "She is, Mamma," Sophie answered for her as they sat on the cream sofa, Your papa is in his study with Mr. Guy Lucas. They will join us. Aren't Paul and Helen home? Sophie asked about her oldest brother and sister-in-law. No, they have gone to Bingley to visit Helen's parents, Mrs. Bellingham told them. I received a letter from your brother Oswald this morning. He has arrived safely back in Oxford and back to his studies. She spoke of her youngest son. The Christmas holiday does seem to go by so awfully fast. It will not be long until it is Easter and he is home again, Sophie said, as her father and Mr. Guy Lucas entered the room. Evie smiled warmly at both men. Goodness me, such delightful company we have, Mr. Bellingham declared. Although not a large man, Jasper Bellingham had a large personality. Known for his acute business brain and his swift ability to turn a penny into a pound, he suffered no fools and was fiercely proud of who he'd become after starting life humbly as a schoolteacher's son. Is your father well, Miss Davenport? He is, sir, and mentioned to me at breakfast that he shall call on you tomorrow afternoon. Evie was still a little nervous talking to the man, for he scowled more than he smiled. Yet he'd only ever been courteous towards her, and he'd become a good friend of her papa's. Excellent. I shall be home from 3 o'clock. Mr. Bellingham took a seat by the fire, inviting Mr. Lucas to do the same. Have you heard from Alexander, Guy? Mrs. Bellingham asked Mr. Lucas about his son, giving Sophie a sideways glance. Not since last week. In his last letter, he mentioned travelling to South Carolina. Your son doesn't seem to be in a hurry to return home to Yorkshire, Mrs. Bellingham chuckled. I agree. He is relishing his time in America and learning a great deal, Mr. Lucas said, in his quiet way. I hope he has not forgotten us, Mrs. Bellingham said lightly. We all miss him, do we not, Sophie? Yes, Mamma, Sophie blushed. As maids brought in tea trays filled with an assortment of sandwiches and cakes, tea and coffee pots, Evie studied Mr. Lucas, a pleasant gentleman she'd met several times at dinner parties hosted by the Bellinghams. Mr. Lucas owned 2 mills in the area, mainly woolen textile operations. However, his only son, Alexander, had begun a cotton mill in his own right, instead of working with his father. Sophie had told her Alexander wanted to create his own business empire and not be given his father's when he hadn't done anything to earn it. Evie had thought that a terribly noble idea and most unusual. Someone doing something different always caught her attention. He should be careful, though, Mr. Bellingham stated. The American states are becoming a hotbed of turmoil. The argument of freeing the slaves is gaining ground, especially in the north. Do not think I am not aware of it, Jasper, Mr. Lucas sighed heavily. My last letter to Alexander was to ask him to return to England. He has learned enough of cotton and made many contacts. It is time he was home. Does he buy cotton from the slave-owning plantations? Evie asked. She had read much about the situation in America. I believe he does, yes, Mr. Lucas answered. And he does not care about the conditions those poor people suffer to grow and harvest that cotton. Mrs. Bellingham gasped slightly, and Mr. Bellingham frowned. Mr. Lucas gave her a polite smile. I will not answer for my son, Miss Davenport. His opinions are his own. And what are yours, sir? Evie asked. She and her papa had conversed greatly about slavery, amongst many other subjects. Papa supported her need to learn about the world. He regarded education as a highly admired skill, and he didn't want his only child to be an ignorant dolt. Mr. Lucas accepted a cup of tea from Mrs. Bellingham. I have woolen mills, therefore I have no need for cotton. What happens in other countries are for those nations to contend with. So you support your son's dealings with slave owners? Evie persisted. I do, if it makes good business sense. I cannot change how men earn their fortunes, Miss Davenport, or the laws in other countries. But you can act morally. He shook his head when offered a plate of tartlets. I do not interfere, Miss Davenport. I run my mills and see to my own business. Yes, but, Evie dear, allow Mr. Lucas to have his tea, shall we? Mrs. Bellingham interrupted. We are not a debating society. Forgive me, Mrs. Bellingham. Mr. Lucas. She apologised instantly. There is nothing to forgive, Miss Davenport, Mr. Lucas replied. A young woman should ask questions and be interested in the world. Only not everything is as simple or fair as we wish it to be. Of course. She gave a tentative smile, knowing she'd gone too far, and he was gentlemanly enough to let it pass. She stared down into her teacup. There were times when she wished she'd not opened her mouth. Other people's drawing rooms were not her sounding box, and she'd do well to remember it. Later, alone with Sophie in her bedroom, Evie flopped onto the wide four-poster bed with a groan. I made a fool out of myself with Mr. Lucas. Oh, it is fine. It is not the first time or the last, knowing you, Sophie teased, walking to the window. Well, next time, give me a sharp kick. With pleasure. Evie sat up and gazed at her friend's sad face. What is the matter? Nothing. Sophie stared out of the window at the white world beyond. Did I embarrass you? Lord, no. I am used to your outbursts by now. Thank you, Evie said sarcastically. Then what is it? You know you will tell me anyway. No, it is foolish, really. Sophie nibbled her fingernails, then quickly put her hands behind her back, as though her former governess was in the room and would slap her hands away from her mouth. Is it foolish? Perhaps. Sophie came and sat on the edge of the bed. Not once did Mr. Lucas mention that Alexander was wanting to come home. He has been gone for nearly 2 years. In all that time, I have received only 4 short letters from him, covering 2 Christmases and 2 of my birthdays. They were such plain notes, telling me what he was experiencing, but nothing of what is in his heart. And have you written to him about your own heart? Evie asked. Goodness, no. That would be too forward. Would it? Why would it be wrong to make it clear how you feel? You cannot expect a gentleman to write of such sentiments if you are unwilling to do the same. Indeed. Only it is such an admission, isn't it? Do you want to marry him? Sophie blushed. I think I do. Yes. He is older than me. He became a man while I was still a child. You make him sound ancient, Evie laughed. He is 30 years of age at least, a man who knows his own mind. 30? Hardly old. Our papas are old. Look at me, I'm 23. Does that make me archaic? Sophie looked unsure. Evie laughed. Maybe I am, compared to your 20 years. How can I know what I truly feel about him when he has been away for so long, and before that we were simply friends? Sophie fiddled with her sleeve, her expression full of doubt. Oh, I know Papa and Mr. Lucas often joked about aligning our 2 families together, which I thought to be thrilling, for Alexander is devilishly handsome. But what if he thought it all a huge joke? Am I being a fool to wait for him? You won't know until you speak to him about it. Write a letter to him. I couldn't possibly. Sophie wrung her hands together. I shall put it from my mind until I see him again. Once he has returned home, I shall know how the situation lies. Good. Now, No more talk of Mr. Alexander Lucas, Evie declared, for the gentleman doesn't deserve all this fuss if he hasn't made his intentions clear. But he is very suitable. And handsome, so you keep saying, Evie chuckled. I think to be his bride would be a dream come true, Sophie whispered, as though afraid to even suggest such a thing. But he is too good for me. He is worldly, well-travelled. Nonsense. You are too good for him, or any man. As my friend, you have to say that. Evie scrambled off the bed. As your friend, I am refusing to allow you to speak of him again for the rest of the day. Now, let us go down to the kitchen and ask Mrs. Freeman if she will show us how to cook something. Oh dear, not again, Sophie moaned, a look of dread on her face. It was fun, learning how to make a cake last time. Mamma was not impressed when she found out, Sophie grimaced. I received a lecture after you went home. Mamma says it is not the done thing to enter the servants' quarters for our own entertainment. Then I shall ask our own cook, Mrs. Humphrey. She will let us. Evie was well aware of the difference between the two houses. Bellingham Hall had a small army of servants to cater for the family, the hall and estate, whereas her papa had only engaged Mrs. Humphrey, Lizzie, a kitchen maid, Fanny, the housemaid, as well as Mr. Bronson to drive the carriage and care for the horses, and his son Colin, who did all the heavy jobs around the house. Still, the difference in their households didn't matter to her or Sophie. Evie didn't envy Sophie, and she knew Sophie didn't look down upon her just because she had a smaller house and less staff. They were both young women, brought up in a genteel world of the upper middle class, and each, in their own way, needed a dear friend, especially Evie. This new, stricter world could be rather stifling with all its rules for young women. After a life in India full of relaxed social gatherings, of bathing in the sea, riding her horse across the sands, of assisting in her mamma's good works, and being free to express herself without censure, England felt closed, limited. I do not want to learn how to cook. I shall have servants to do that. I want to travel, Sophie declared. To where? Evie peeped out of the window, noticing the Bellinghams' other carriage had arrived, and Sophie's eldest brother Paul and his wife Helen descend from it. Anywhere. I have been nowhere. You have? You have gone to many places, Evie reminded her. Not like you have, though. You were born in India and visited Egypt and France, and you are only 23. I want to see foreign countries too. Evie glanced back at her. Maybe when you are married to Mr. Lucas, he will take you to other countries. I hope so, if he is not too concerned with his mill. Perhaps I need to marry a diplomat and go to live in foreign climes, though I would miss you, of course. I haven't seen too many diplomats in Lilston, Evie laughed. Sometimes Sophie sounded very young and naive. Sophie pulled a face. No, it does not look hopeful for me to be introduced to one. That is for certain. You and I should go somewhere, Evie declared. By ourselves? With a suitable chaperone, of course. Mamma would have a fit, Sophie sighed. No, our lives are to be non-eventful. I can feel it. Speak for yourself. Evie gave Sophie a sharp look. I fully intend to have a fabulous life. When Papa feels the loss of Mamma a little less, and is more inclined to look for happiness, then he and I will keep each other company in our lovely house, and, in the summer months, tour the country, seeing the sights. She longed for the days when her papa would be more his old self, when she could suggest they travel beyond Yorkshire. And what of a husband? I have told you previously many times that I do not wish to marry. I wish to remain a maiden all my life, like my elderly aunts, and do as I please all my days. In her mind, being married, keeping house, and having a baby every year was not something she was willing to accept. How could such a humdrum life be her future when her thoughts were so alive with experiencing new adventures? She wanted to trek the Scottish Highlands, explore the ancient ruins of Greece, walk the roads of Rome, and so much more. You make it sound so simple. Papa talks of grandchildren all the time. All of us must bring forth the next generation. It's our duty. Sophie seemed worried. The very thought frightens me to death. You do not have expectations placed on you as I have. True. Papa just wishes for me to be happy, whatever that may be. People can be happily married, Evie. Sophie spoke as though to convince herself more than Evie. My parents are, as were yours. Yes, and look at the pain Papa suffers now, because he loved so deeply. Evie shivered, remembering his harrowing sobs when Mamma died, and the change in him ever since. To love is to suffer. I shall do without, thank you. I am quite content, it being just Papa and myself forever. Unless Mrs. Meyer gets her way and marries your Papa. Evie's blood ran cold at the thought of that woman snaring her beloved Papa. Do not even mention it, I beg you. Chapter 2. The sound of arguing drifted up the hallway from the kitchen to where Evie stood at the bottom of the staircase, sorting through the post that had just been delivered. Frowning at the noise, she marched down to the kitchen door and opened it to find Fanny and Lizzie. What's all this fuss? Evie asked in surprise and with a little annoyance. They both stared at her, red-faced from their disagreement. Miss, can you tell Lizzie here that I am the housemaid and therefore above her in rank, as she is only a kitchen maid? Fanny snapped, eyeing Lizzie with contempt. I am the senior kitchen maid. The only one, Fanny argued hotly. I see to the house, which makes me higher in rank than you. Not in the kitchen. Fanny's eyes narrowed. You're not telling me what to do, Lizzie. I need a hand in here, said Lizzie, her hands balling into fists. You need to help me. I have my own jobs to do. Goodness. Please. Fanny, Lizzie, stop. Evie glared at them. What does it matter? It matters, miss, because when Mrs. Humphrey isn't here, then one of us has to be in charge, Lizzie defended. And that's me, Fanny snapped. Not in the kitchen, Lizzie argued. Evie looked around the kitchen, a decent-sized room with a high ceiling and a large black-leaded range going along one wall. A huge window let in light over the wooden workbench, which was covered in assorted vegetables being peeled, or they had been. Steam billowed from cooking pots, and on the table in the middle of the room were 2 chickens in the process of being stuffed with sage and breadcrumbs. Where is Mrs. Humphrey? She didn't turn up this morning. I cook breakfast for the Major and yourself, miss, Lizzie supplied. But when I'm cooking, I need a hand in here. Colin helps a bit, but Fanny could do more. Fanny gasped. I can't be your skivvy and see to the dining room at the same time now, can I? You seem to think you're the only one who has to do all the jobs in this house, Lizzie flared, hands on hips, her wispy brown hair falling out from beneath her white cap. Please, enough. Evie held up her hands. Why hasn't Mrs. Humphrey arrived? She's usually here by 6 o'clock. And why haven't I been informed? Sorry, miss, we were that busy getting the breakfast on and the fires lit. We thought to just get on with everything until Mrs. Humphrey turned up. But she hasn't, and it's now past 9 o'clock, Evie frowned. I or my papa should have been told before now. Yes, Sorry, miss. Lizzie bowed her head. Where in the village does Mrs. Humphrey live exactly? I know it is Meadow Lane, but what number? It is the last cottage at the end of the lane, miss. Do you want me to go? Fanny asked. No, thank you. I shall go, and I would ask you to get on with your duties, or I will reconsider your employment here and find someone else who will work without disruption. She turned away to the door, then turned back. And neither of you are senior to the other. You are equal in your own domains. Let that be the end of it. Irritated by the interruption, Evie walked along the corridor to Papa's study and gently knocked before entering. Papa, Mrs. Humphrey hasn't arrived today, so I am going to her cottage to check that she is well. Oh, right. Yes. Major Davenport took off his reading glasses and placed his pen back in its stand. I do hope she hasn't fallen ill. I shall get to the bottom of it. Do you want me to come with you? He ran a hand over his wispy grey hair. No, I will go alone. I wouldn't want to embarrass Mrs. Humphrey by us both landing on her doorstep. Indeed. She rounded the desk and kissed his forehead. He looked so much older since Mamma died. The strong, gallant soldier had been replaced by an old man. His tall stature seemed reduced somewhat, his shoulders bowed. It was rare for her to hear his booming laugh now, which saddened her, for it was the sound of her childhood. Her papa's humour and good nature made him friends wherever he went, and Evie adored him. I shan't be long. Do you need anything from the village while I'm there? No, nothing, but you must buy something if it takes your eye. He took a small leather purse out of the top drawer and gave it to her. There is enough in there to purchase something pretty. Perhaps you might want to ride into Bingley or Riddlesden. I do not need something pretty, Papa, she smiled, but I might go for a ride afterwards, unless Mrs. Humphrey needs assistance. She changed into her riding habit of black wool with a matching hat and black veil, and then went down to the kitchen to see if Mrs. Humphrey had arrived, but the quarrelling maids shook their heads at her inquiry, and so she left them to it and exited via the scullery. With January out of the way, February had heralded milder weather for its first week. The sun shone from a clear blue sky, melting the snow, so there was a constant background noise of dripping and running water as the drains filled and the beck that ran down beside the house flowed high and fast from the thaw. Crossing the cobbled yard, Evie sucked in a deep breath of crisp, fresh air. The stable block was hidden behind a stone wall, but the sound of hooves striking the yard's flagstone floor alerted her to the activity before she entered the archway. Mr. Bronson and his son Colin were busy, their backs to her as she walked closer. Colin was polishing the carriage, while Mr. Bronson had her papa's horse, Jupiter, out of his stall and was checking his hooves. Good morning, Evie smiled. Morning, miss. Mr. Bronson dipped his flat cap to her. You are wanting Star? Yes, please. I am to ride down to the village and call upon Mrs. Humphrey. She has not turned up today. Aye, the girls said when we went in for breakfast, Colin said, going into the stables to fetch Star. He was a nice young man, just 18 and always smiling and happy. He and his father lived above the stables. It is most unusual. Evie scratched Star's long nose as Colin tied the horse to a ring in the wall and began assembling her saddle gear. I bet her son is about again, Mr. Bronson murmured. Her son? Evie frowned. I didn't know she had a son, or any children. She told us at her interview that she had moved here alone, a widow. Aye, she did. Her son doesn't live with her. Mr. Bronson began to brush Jupiter's flanks. He lives at Her Majesty's pleasure, Colin snorted with scorn. It took a moment for Evie to understand his meaning, and then her eyes widened. Prison? Colin threw the saddlecloth over Star's back. Oh, aye. In and out he is. Mrs. Humphrey tries to escape him, but he always finds her. She thought being up here in the village away from Keighley, her last position, would give her some peace. But perhaps he's found her again. That's enough, Colin, Mr. Bronson warned. It's none of our business. Colin said no more and finished saddling Star. He took her over to the mounting step so Evie could easily mount. Thoughtful, Evie tapped her heels to walk Star out of the stable yard and down the drive. The revelation that her cook had a son in prison was alarming. Should she have known? Would Mamma have found out about her servants' past before hiring them? Had she made an error employing Mrs. Humphrey? Though at face value the older woman was a decent cook and hard-working. Should her mother be punished for her son's sins? Evie thought not. With the sun shining, the day was a beautiful, clear winter's morning. Birds fluttered between the branches in the trees, their tweets and chatter lovely to hear after the silence of the cold, snowy days. Although wet from melting snow, the lane down to the village wasn't icy, and Evie could relax and enjoy the experience of being on horseback for the first time in weeks. She waved to Mr. Lund, his ever-present pipe hanging out of his mouth. He was herding his sheep across a pasture, his sheepdog circling at his whistles. At the bottom of the lane, Evie guided Star to the left and headed for the village, which nestled in a hollow at the bottom of the moor. The main road through the village was only half a mile long, but it boasted one general shop, the public house, a small quaint church, a village hall, and a little cottage school. For anything more, the villagers had to travel just over 3 miles west to Riddlesden, or the same distance east to Bingley. Evie preferred being in a small village rather than in a town or city. As much as she'd enjoyed her time with her aunts in Bradford, the city was dirty and noisy and crowded. The country suited her far better. She wanted to spend her days riding and walking and sitting in the garden rather than making calls and dodging traffic. At first, she'd thought she would deplore the quiet life of a village after the hustle and bustle of India. But after a few months of adjustment, she'd realised the countryside had a lot to offer, such as good riding treks over the moors, and seeing the same people every week became a comfort. She wasn't just a number amongst a horde, as in the subcontinent. Instead, she was known, acknowledged as Miss Davenport from High Lilston House, and that didn't seem too bad. In the village, she nodded to several people she now recognised after living here a year. Mr. Butcher, who owned the public house, was outside cleaning his windows, and Mrs. McNally, who ran the grocer's shop and was also the woman who sorted the village's post, was sweeping her front step. Evie turned into Meadow Lane, opposite the church, and carried on down its winding track to the end. A rather run-down-looking cottage sat in an unkempt garden, the front gate broken off its hinges. She hadn't expected Mrs. Humphrey to live in such a place, for the cook was fastidious about cleanliness in the kitchen and a stickler for rules and organisation. The cottage's appearance shocked her. After dismounting and tying Star to a fence post, Evie gathered up the hem of her riding skirt and, dodging puddles, walked the uneven path to the cottage's front door and knocked. It took several moments before the door opened, and a man lolled